All right, this is our Tuesday night Bible study for the 30th of January, 2018. And we're going through and looking at the testaments of the patriarchs. And we did an introduction last week, basically saying that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls had a theology, the way they interpreted prophecy, and it matches the Christian interpretation of prophecy, like there would be a virgin birth. Isaiah chapter 7 talks about a virgin birth, that the Messiah would be born, that the Messiah did come at a certain date, certain things like that. Where some of the other Jews, the Pharisees, said, no, that's not true. It means something else. And so we were looking at the sources for these things, because anybody can say, well, I believe Isaiah 7 means this, and you might believe it means this. So who knows who's correct or not? Well, the Talmud, which would be the Pharisees, they say they go by the oral Torah, which is really hard to prove or disprove since it's based on oral tradition. The Dead Sea Scroll, the Essenes, have their theology in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they say their authority, or how they interpret prophecy, is the way that the patriarchs taught them. And the patriarchs would be Adam, that lineage in Genesis, Adam through to Noah, and Shem down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Levi, Kohath, Amram, and then Aaron. So that lineage there is about 40 people, and supposedly the legend is that they all wrote testaments, which explains things to dealing with their kids. And so what we wanted to do is look at these things. I'm not saying that this is authoritative, but just if you went to a Baptist church, the Baptists would say, we believe in this because, and this is our authority, probably a charter or something. You go to somebody who believes the exact opposite of what a Baptist would, and they have their authority with their source. They didn't make it up. Everybody inherited these things. So we want to look at the source material for that. But it's interesting to know that the theology and the prophecies from the Essenes and the Christians are almost identical. So, which is totally different than the Pharisees. So we're wanting to look at these things, Pharisees and Sadducees. So with that in mind, last time we said we don't have anything from Adam, although we have a quote from Josephus talking about Adam predicted that the world would be destroyed twice, once by water and once by fire. And he didn't really know which one was first, or that's all they knew. And of course the prophecy that somehow through one of his descendants, someone would come that would fix this problem between God and man. So we're starting like at the very beginning. That's about all you know. That's the sum total of all prophecy at that point. So what we did is we looked at the Testament of Enos, and we saw that it starts out talking about how my son Canaan, who is the whatever generation, and his son is the next generation, all the way down to Enoch, who's the seventh generation. So we know we're talking about Enos. And he basically just said a few things about things get strange, and of course it's extremely fragmented, so we don't have a whole lot about it. Just to know that there's a fragment of that, though, is pretty interesting. And your first thought would be like, well, this has to be fiction, or I would have heard about it before. And I'm not saying that it is fiction or is not fiction, but what I'm definitely saying is the Essenes used that section, the testaments of the patriarchs, for their theology. So they believed, and the Pharisees absolutely didn't believe. And so anything like that is worth studying, where you can figure out those things. So today we want to look at a few parts of the Testament of Noah. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's one scroll called the Genesis Apocryphon, and it was kind of misnamed because people started looking at it, and it's got stuff that deals with the Genesis, Abraham and that time period. So they just figured it was like an apocryphon, a commentary maybe on Genesis, and kind of set it aside. But if you look at it careful, it's part of these testaments of these patriarchs, because it'll be divided in the book of this and the book of that. Now, the Genesis Apocryphon is only, I think, 4 or 5 leaves long. But when you put a bunch of leaves together, you usually number them. Like the first one is Aleph, the next one is Bet, on down. Where this starts is actually Kaf, or letter K. So it's like we've missed the first 13 leaves. And a leaf has got like 5 columns of like 30 lines. So we're talking about, that's a lot of data that we're missing. So it starts kind of in the middle. So let's just look at this. It's got some really interesting parts that I wanted to look at. We won't look at the whole thing, but so it's 1Q20, And again, that means it was found in the first cave in Qumran. It's the 20th scroll they found. And on columns 6 to 18, we have this particular testament of Noah. So it starts out saying this is a copy of the words of Noah. So it's one of those testaments. And he starts out, and this is interesting. Let's just look at this. It says, "From my birth, my mother taught me the ways of righteousness. My whole life I walked in the truth of the Holy One as he had instructed. I kept away from the paths of deceit, which lead to eternal darkness. I studied the visions of truth and wisdom, praying ceaselessly, and avoided the paths of violence." So let's stop there for a minute. This is interesting. His mother, which would be, this is Noah, so Lamech's wife, taught him the true path of righteousness. Avoid sin, practice righteousness. Why? Because there's one God that created us. And you, at this point, you could probably go back and check with Adam, because Adam would still be alive. So you could go back and check these things, but she taught him. So we're supposed to teach our kids everything. And this is the general pattern, the way it's always been. So he actually believed it, and he kept away from the paths of darkness. But notice this, he said he studied the visions of truth and wisdom, praying ceaselessly. So he didn't come up and say, "Hey, Dad, tell me that story again." Okay, I'm still not getting that. "Dad, tell me that story again." Okay, one more time. "Dad, tell me that story again." What we're seeing here is that Dad apparently wrote that story down. To study something is you take out a scroll and look at it again, just like we do with our Bible. So again, this is showing that the patriarchs had written their testimonies down, and we saw just a smidgen of Enos, and now we're looking at Noah saying, I read those things. I understand the prophecies. I began to see what was going on, and so I've tried to understand the visions of truth that God would give to his ancestors. Interesting. Wouldn't it be interesting if your dad was a prophet? Not a fake prophet like all the cults have, but I mean somebody who really heard of God. Or maybe you come home from school one day, you walk in the room and your dad is standing there and there's this large angel standing there talking with him, you know, and then zips away and Dad turns around and says, "So, let's have some hamburgers." You know, and you're like, may I ask what the conversation was? You know, it's like, well, I'll write it down later. Wouldn't that be interesting? So he studied the visions of truth and wisdom, praying ceaselessly. "Even after becoming an adult," he says, "I continued in righteousness, I grew in wisdom," and then there's a fragment break there. "I married," and this says Imzerah, and you'll see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The names are usually a lot different. A lot of times it's a translation of what the name means. Like my name is Ken, and literally if you, in Hebrew, that means yes. So I'm not going to have the name of yes, because every time, I always used to bug me. I'd go to a Hebrew class and they'd be asking a yes or no question. Ken velo, you know, yes or no. And somebody yell, "Ken!" And I'm like, quit yelling at me. You know, I know what they're doing. I couldn't quite get over that. People yelling your name all the time. So in Hebrew, my name is Zvi, but that's beside the point. But it all depends on how you translate it or what it means. Anyway, this is Imzerah. It means seed of a relative. In other words, he married a godly woman. And of course, according to the book of Jasher, he married Naamah, who was Enoch's daughter. So he's talking about his great-grandfather's daughter. So, and that happened a lot back then. It's more important to marry someone that has the same faith, that has a relationship with God, than anything else. So he says he married her, and she bore to me 3 sons and daughters. So we know what the 3 sons are, be Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Later I took of the 3 daughters of my brothers for the wives for my sons, according to the marriage custom that the Lord of eternity gave to Adam. Now I thought that was pretty interesting, because we have the marriage customs of the Jews as recorded in the Mosaic law, and we're told according to Gentile law, there's other customs. And sometimes you have under the old Gentile law that people would basically just start living together and they're married. They're divorced when they just separate. And that happens in cultures where they don't have marriage licenses. And it would used to drive the Israelis insane. And I think that's a lot of what Paul was talking about is if you're coming from that culture and you guys got saved and you walk in here, you really don't have a marriage license. In your culture, you don't get divorce papers. So what happens when my spouse is an unbeliever, I'm a believer, and because of that, they just walk off? Well, there's nothing to be done. I mean, that in that culture, you're divorced. So you can't do anything about it. He says that a believer is not under bondage in such things. So it's just like if my spouse gave me divorce papers, I might contest it, but ultimately if they wanted to leave, there's nothing you can do about it. So there's that kind of thing. And some of the Jewish groups were saying Gentiles never had a marriage license or a marriage law. And I think it wasn't at that point, but as we can see here originally, way back when, that used to be the way it is. You have a custom and a ceremony, it doesn't really matter what, but your family and my family okay it. We have a marriage ceremony, and at a certain part, we're married. You don't just start living with people. And I just thought that was interesting. Everybody's got different marriage customs, but you have to get married. And so he says he took his wife and got wives for his brothers according to the marriage custom that the Lord of eternity gave to Adam. So just like Jesus said from the beginning, it's one man for one woman for life. And you're not supposed to divorce or break that up or separate. So I just thought that was interesting. So seeing in here, it's like we've always had a marriage license type thing. So he goes, he continues and says, after many years, about 10 jubilees, so they're using the jubilee system. So that was interesting. The time when my sons should have been married, the Lord appeared to me in a vision and showed me the conduct of the sons of heaven. And it goes on, and he has a particular vision here. And he talks about the Nephilim and the Watchers and the different things that happens. So I'm going to skip down here to column 10. Actually, there was one other piece here. Column 8 is interesting because he's reading something. He says, this is badly fragmented, but he's in the ark and the flood's going on. He says throughout the entire flood, something about the King of Heaven, and he has this vision, and it says, in your week, everything occurring in its week, and in the written account this week, it's about 3 weeks, and then I went. So it's really hard to understand what he's talking about here. But remember when we studied the book of Enoch, and he had the prophecy of the weeks, the 10 weeks? Thought it was interesting. In the 3rd week would have been the time with Noah. And so he's studying these things, trying to figure out that. Now, in the text that we have, there's not much there, so there's not much to study. So we keep reading here that if that's what he's talking about, there's more information that he had. But now if you go to column 10, the flood is over, and eventually when it's okay, they come out and they begin to start planting crops and colonizing and this kind of stuff. So he says, then I blessed the Lord of all who kept me safe. I, Noah, spoke these words to them. He's talking to his kids. Now go and give praise and glory to the Creator. Remember the instructions of our Lord, who is the King of all ages, forever and ever. The ark rested on one of the mountains of Ararat. See here, he says, I atoned for the whole earth. First, I offered a male goat, and he goes on talking about a sacrifice that he does. So we remember in Genesis that Noah made a sacrifice, and Noah planted a vineyard, and then eventually it says he got drunk, and he awoke, and that's the time when Canaan or Ham did something. And it's always been a question of what in the world happened. So he goes on and talks about these things. Let me get to column 11. He says, I, Noah, was at the door of the ark when the waters receded. And he says, my sons and their sons were there with him. There was mountains, valleys, wilderness, and coastlands. He says, then I, Noah, went out and walked through the breadth and the depth of the land. It had been reborn with grass and herbs and grain, fruit trees with leaves. And I blessed the Lord of heaven and gave glory to him. So that's pretty interesting. It'd been a year, and the waters receded, but the plants started growing back really quick, or the Lord maybe did a miracle, but all those animals would have had to have food. And this is something interesting. I mean, they were supposed to be able to start eating meat at this point But for a little while you wouldn't, because you only have like 2 or 3 cows or 7 cows. You want the animals to reproduce for a while before you start eating food or eating meat. He says, I bless the Lord of heaven, gave glory to him. He showed his love for his creation by removing and obliterating all those who practice violence, wickedness, deceit, but rescued the righteous man. And he sees this vision. He says, a heavenly one appeared to me and said, do not fear, Noah. I will be with you and all of your sons who will be like you forever. That's interesting. All of your sons who will be like you. So we all have a choice of following the Lord or not following the Lord, and he'll be with those who want to be with him. It says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, rule over all of them, over its seas, over its wilderness, over the mountains, over everything that's in them. Now I give everything to you and to your sons for food, that of the vegetation, the herbs of the land, but the blood you shall not eat. And then that fragment ends. So we're seeing here the same thing in the book of Genesis chapter 9, where he is allowed to eat meat, but you can't eat living creatures. You're not supposed to eat blood. It's supposed to be slaughtered correctly. And so that's a part of the Noahide law that has continued on forever. When we get into Acts 15, and they're talking about, do the Gentiles have to keep the law, get circumcised, do this or do that? How do we do this? And then James said, well, this is what we're going to write to the Gentiles. Stay away from idols, stay away from fornication, from things strangled, and from blood. And if you do those things, you'll be fine. And of course, it goes without saying, don't murder people, don't steal, the moral laws, but things that you might really question as far as what difference does it make what I eat or not? Well, don't eat blood, don't eat anything that's been offered to an idol, stay away from idolatry, stay away from fornication. Of course, they have their own definition of what each one of these things are, which we'll study sometime in the near future. But it's interesting to see all this. And we're seeing here that they're saying, the heavenly one in this vision is saying that Noah is now the king over the earth, which makes sense. He would be. He's dad. The sons have to obey the dad. The families obey the husbands. So he's kind of the king anyway. But he's supposed to rule over them. He gives them the Noahide laws. And they're supposed to stay away from idolatry, worship the one true God, follow the lineage of prophets, Noah, whoever the next prophet is on down, and await this Messiah guy to come and fix things. And that's basically what we're being told. So that's what he's saying here. Column 12, he says, now I have placed my bow in the clouds, that's the rainbow, and it is a sign from me in order to be, and it's fragmented, on the mountains of Ararat. After this I left the mountain. So again, we're seeing that God, just like it is in Genesis 9, God sets the rainbow as a sign of the covenant. So circumcision is the sign of the Levitical covenant. The rainbow is the sign of the Noahide covenant. I thought it's interesting, there's 7 Noahide laws, and there's 7 colors in the rainbow. I don't know if that really means anything or not, but it's really interesting. It sounds like something the Lord would do. Here's a rainbow. It's one thing. It's my covenant, separated into 7 things, so you'll remember the 7 laws. So he goes on and says, after this I left the mountain, which would be where the ark is at. My sons and I had to rebuild the cities because the devastation was great. And then my sons had many sons and daughters after the flood. My oldest son Shem had a son, Arphaxad, 2 years after the flood. Same thing as it says in Genesis. And all of Shem's sons were, and it starts listing them, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, same things that we have in Genesis. And then skipping that part, it says, my sons and I began to plant crops. I planted a great vineyard on Mount Lubar, and in 4 years it produced great amounts of wine for me. So I brought out the wine when the first feast came. This would have been New Year's, which I'm assuming would be, since the Mosaic law hadn't yet been given, New Year's would be Rosh Hashanah, Yom Torah. So New Year's, in other words. So they brought out the wine to do a celebration, to have a feast, on the first day of the first feast in the first month. So that would have to be first of Tishrei. In the midst of my vineyard, I opened this vessel, and began to drink from it on the first day of the 5th year of the vineyard. So it took 4 years to get a good crop and then to make wine, which is part of the, the wine and the unleavened bread and stuff like that we see with Melchizedek and all the others. On that day, I and my sons and my grandsons with all of our wives and daughters gathered together at the altar. So he built an altar. And I blessed the Lord of heaven, the Most High God, the great Holy One who saved us from destruction, which my fathers hid, and I laid down upon my bed, and my mind stirred. So this is in Genesis the same thing when Noah, it says that he not got drunk, but he drank his wine, and then laid down to go to sleep. And then while he's asleep, according to Genesis, Ham comes and does something. And he comes out and he makes fun of him, and because he's naked because he's went to sleep. A lot of times you do that, not sleeping with all your clothes on. So Shem and Japheth get some sort of covering, and it says they walk backwards, out of respect for their father. They cover him up, and then he wakes up, and this has always been a really odd thing in Genesis. He wakes up and discovers what Ham has done. Okay, and the question is, what did Ham do? And then the other odd thing is he discovers what Ham did, and he curses Canaan. Now, Canaan is one of Ham's sons, but generally, if my dad did something to you, why pick on me? There's more to the story there. And so this goes on in Noah's own words and explains the rest of the story. So at this point, he has a feast. It's New Year's. They drank of the wine. He goes to bed, and Ham does his thing and everything, and then he wakes up. But this is the deal. He lays down, and his mind stirs, and he has a dream. And this is what's fascinating to me, because if he has this dream, and it's prophetic, and he wakes up, and then he begins to realize that part of the dream has already happened. So if you have a dream about like 5 things, and it goes from worse to worse, and you wake up and you find out the first one's already happened, it's prophetic, so these others are going to happen, you make sure that you're guarded against evil that's coming. That's the whole point of the dream. And this is why he curses Ham, or learns what Ham is doing and curses Canaan. So this is badly fragmented, not too bad, but somewhat fragmented. But here's what it says. This person appears to him and says, this is column 13, it's the dream that he has. It says, you, Noah, are the king, and all that you decree, is whatever, and the part's fragmented. So basically, he's the king of the earth. He's supposed to create laws, the 7 Noahide laws, and govern people and make them be holy. But he sees in this dream, he says, he sees forests with all the birds of heaven and the beasts of the field, the cattle of the land, the creeping things of the dry ground, the stones and the clay that were cutting down the forest to make a place for themselves. I really wish we had this entire dream. It would make perfect sense, I think. But I think we can figure out most of it. Then also there is gold, silver, brass, and iron that were cutting the forest down to make a place for themselves. At this point I stop and I'm thinking, the symbols always reoccur all the way through the Patriarchs and all the way through the Old Testament. Remember Daniel's dream of the empires? The first one was gold, and then silver, and then brass, and then iron. Well, we've got here gold, silver, brass, and iron. So these are kingdoms that will come up later and try to destroy the righteous seed, which will become Israel. And we don't know that yet, but it's obvious as we get down to it what that represents. They're cutting down the forest to make a place for themselves. The forest is the entire world, and these empires just try to take over and destroy everything. So then I watched as the sun, the moon, and the stars cut down the forest to make it theirs. Now, in Genesis, we also see the sun, the moon, and the stars, 11 stars, is a dream Joseph has. And everybody knows what the symbols mean, because when he goes to his dad and said, I had a dream of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they all bowed down to me, instantly Dad got really angry, remember, and said, you think your mom and I are going to bow down to you? what pompous arrogance is this, And of course, that's exactly what happened. He was elevated to a place where they did. So they all understood the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars as mom, dad. And so we're talking about the nation of Israel with the tribes. So I watched as the sun, moon, and the stars were cut down part of the forest to make it theirs. So there's wars that the Jews have to fight. Finally, the swarming things of the earth and the water consumed it. When the water ceased, it ended. I'm not sure what it is because, again, it's fragmented. Then I saw that olive tree had grown tall. So there's an olive tree in the beginning of the dream that we're told about. The olive tree is always a symbol of Israel, and the cedar tree is always a symbol of the patriarchs. So we'll see that in a little bit. It continued to grow for many hours, and it was bearing fruit and a great amount of foliage. And I wondered about the olive tree and its abundance of leaves. Everything was tying ropes onto it, and the winds of heaven blew violently against this olive tree, ripping off its branches and breaking it into pieces. First, a wind blew from the west. It struck it and caused the leaves and fruit to fall from it, scattered it to the winds. And after this, a northern wind and that part goes away. Now, we do know that Israel was taken captive to Babylon, and then were scattered to the four winds with Rome. And according to the church fathers, there's only supposed to be 2 expulsions. So now they're back, and there's not going to be another expulsion like that. So this could very easily be something along those lines. Column 14 says, you were thinking about the tree and its upper branch separating and budding with much fruit and foliage. So this is an angel explaining the dream to him now. Understand that you are the great cedar tree that was standing before you on the mountaintop in your dream. The shoots which emerged from it grew equal to its height. Those are your 3 sons. The first shoot that you saw, adhering to the cedar trunk, was one branch separating from it and becoming an olive tree, means the first son will not separate you from all of his days, and among his seed your name will be called. From his division all your sons will be blessed, and from the first son will come forth a righteous planting, to be the nation of Israel, for all, standing fast forever. The second shoot, adhering to the trunk of the cedar tree, and the branch of the third, brings darkness. And a few of their bows enter into the midst of the bows of the first one. These represent 2 sons. So we'll stop there at this point. But basically, he has this dream. If we pull these together, we see the last half of the dream, and then we see the first half of the angel interpreting the dream. So we have enough to kind of like put them together and see. So basically, he has a dream that he sees this great cedar tree, and the cedar tree, gets really tall. On this, there's a mountain with nothing else on it, and then one long cedar tree. The cedar tree sprouts 3 branches, and the first branch grows and kind of goes off and becomes an olive vine, which grows and stuff. And he's watching that happen. And then the third branch over here, branches come out and they're evil, and they kind of intermingle with the other branches and try to take over. And then some sort of a war happens or something. So then that's all gone, and he turns his attention to the olive tree. And at this time, man, it's grown really big too. And then the angel comes and interprets this and says, you are the cedar tree. You're starting the entire human race over. The 3 branches are your 3 sons. The first branch is your first son, who won't separate from you. He will be godly, and your seed will be named through him. And through him, the righteous seed will be planted. That's the nation of Israel, the olive tree. And the one who fixes things, the Messiah, will come through him. And in the meantime, there are 2 sons from the tribe of Ham, 2 of Ham's sons, that's the third one, that cause some sort of a problem. And one of them attacks from the coast and one attacks from the north. So that's obviously Canaan and Nimrod. And we see those things happening. So what happens then, he has this dream, he wakes up and realizes that Ham, whatever Ham did at that point, is just showing his true colors. So Shem has been godly, very obedient to his father. Japheth is, a good son, but just a son. And Ham, you always wonder about that kid. It's just one of those things. And then there's other things beginning to happen. So when he wakes up from this dream, he realizes this is not just a dream. This is already started. So he goes on here and says the first thing that he does then, he curses Canaan for what happens. That makes perfect sense now, because the people that are going to invade, he would curse Nimrod also. So the first thing he does is he goes to Shem, tells Shem the dream, and says, based on that dream, I know that you're supposed to be the next king priest. So I'm going to teach you the priesthood, give you the holy books, and from you, the lineage will go on. From one of your descendants, some righteous person will come and create this special nation, and out of that special nation, the Messiah will come. And there's a little bit at the end about the Messiah coming and destroying the wicked ones and casting them into an eternal fire and creating an everlasting kingdom, but it's really badly fragmented. But it's interesting, we see the same basic dream set, the same basic set of instructions. So Adam is told, through one of your kids, a Messiah will come. So eventually it gets down to Noah, and Enoch tells Lamech, his father, that Noah's the one. God's going to destroy the planet. He's going to start over. So obviously the Messiah has to come through Noah. Noah's got 3 kids. And so now we're being told one's evil, one's just a guy, and the other guy is righteous. And he's going to be the one to have the sacred seed and everything. So it's going to come through him. So now we have a prophecy of Messiah. The nation of Israel will come through Shem and his line. So they're looking hard at Arphaxad at this point, firstborn. Arphaxad doesn't really end up being very godly, but so it's a really interesting thing, and this actually explains a lot. Why would Noah didn't get drunk, or anything, but he drank the wine, he did the festival, he did the sacrifices, they had the feast, he went to sleep, he has this dream, he wakes up. Even if it's just Ham came in and made fun of his father. I mean, that shows you've got one son that loves you and is godly, the other son is just there, and just a normal, I'm sure he loves his father, but he's not like studying the scripts and wanting to pray and all this stuff like Shem was. And this other guy constantly wants to make fun and belittle, and you get the opinion if you turned your back on him too much, he's liable to do something bad. Watch your kids with him, that kind of a thing. So he's beginning to see this, and of course that happens. We get Canaan and we get Nimrod, and those things happen. So utterly fascinating. So we'll stop there for tonight, but that's one of probably the main things that we learned prophecy-wise from the Testament of Noah.